Several attempts were made by the authority to make contact with the expedition after this message was received, but no reply came to our inquiries. As incomplete as the message was, the state of emergency was clear, and the authority wasted no time in organizing an investigation into the matter. A party of 15 men was assembled, and I was appointed leader of the investigation, being the consultant for the original expedition. The USS Waldorf was chartered by the authority and departed from Baltimore on November 22nd. We left the brisk winter air behind by evening of the first day and made port in San Juan by noon on the 23rd. Whilst docked, our wireless operator toiled ceaselessly over the outfit, trying to make contact with Locora, all to no avail. On the morning of the 24th, we cast off again and made our heading for the floating archipelago. The winds were favorable during our southward flight, but all those aboard were in a state of tangible unease. There was not one man or woman amongst us who had not read and studied what Dr. Van Buren's machine was capable of in its operation, though what preoccupied us most was the thought of what unspeakable catastrophe it was capable of performing in malfunction. We had instruments aboard that would warn us if we were approaching dangerous temporal anomalies, but none of us had even an inkling of what to expect upon our arrival. For my own part, I do not recall what I imagined to find, as the terrible reality of what we indeed found on Locora has eclipsed any other preconceptions I might have had. This discovery marks a point that has divided my life in twain. I cannot recall the state of placid ignorance that preceded the knowledge I now hold. Hereafter there can only be dread when I think of the horror that the passage of time will one day carry us to. It was noon when we crossed the third parallel south, and it was the midshipman on the bridge who first spied the airship 2 miles off our port side and flying at a seemingly identical heading to our own. A spyglass was passed between those of us who had gone topside to observe the ship. It was, upon first sight, the oddest vessel I had ever laid eyes on, and having nothing of the aeronaut or the shipwright in me, I cannot do adequate justice to it by description. I can but call it utterly bizarre in every sense of conception. It was not until I fixed the spyglass upon the bow of the ship and glanced its name that its wildly ludicrous appearance made any contextual sense. The hull bore the name MHS Hysteria, emblazoned in shining brass letters. Rumors have clustered for millennia around the MHS Hysteria and her crew, a notorious band of unregistered time travelers renowned sporadically throughout history for their uncanny adventures. Opinions are divided as to the veracity of each rumor, but certain scholars within the chrononautical community are privy to more direct sources of information regarding the infamous crew. That which was certain is that the Hysteria utilized a time engine designed by its captain, an eccentric inventor named Edward von Arkham, which was more advanced than any time machine known to man. It seemed unlikely that we should encounter them on such a course by mere coincidence, and we wasted no time in composing a wire of inquiry as to their presence and purpose. They replied almost immediately, explaining that their instruments had detected a cluster of temporal anomalies between the 15th and the 26th of December, 5183, in the vicinity of the southern Atlantic sky between the 16th and 17th parallels south and the 24th and 25th meridians west. Correlating these readings with contemporary reports and records, they had quickly concluded that the source of the disturbances was tied to the Van Buren expedition on La Isla de Locora. Their intentions, in short, were very similar to ours. They meant to investigate the cause of the anomalous readings and, if possible, to resolve them. Following their initial reply, they issued a wire of caution, advising us to turn around immediately and fly away from the definite peril that now brooded nebulously on that ill-fated island which we sought. a peril which they neglected to name or describe. This wire prompted a great deal of consideration amongst our party regarding our subsequent course of action. Whilst the Hysteria's crew were illegal, unregistered chrononauts, and therefore had no business interfering with an official federal investigation by the authority, their instruments were undeniably superior to our own, being able to detect readings from Locora from half the world away and 3 centuries past, while ours could not do so from a matter of miles. On the other hand, we had only their word that these alleged anomalies were hazardous, and they had not even bothered to elaborate on how. Even if they were correct and there was a danger on the island, we would be just as obligated to classify and quarantine the cause, and not leave the matter in the hands of anachronistic civilians, qualified though they may be. There was also the chance that the Hysteria had retro-precognitive knowledge of the events following the expedition, and they were intending to alter the course of the established time stream, an act that the authority could not condone. In the end, we elected to fly on as planned, regardless of the Hysteria's warning. As officers of the authority, it was within our right and duty to order the Hysteria to cease and desist. However, having no artillery aboard the Waldorf, and knowing full well the Hysteria's reputation for disregard of authority of any kind, we wired the anachronists with a formal invitation to join our investigation, hoping to employ their superior machinery in the event of its necessity. They sent back a wire of acceptance, remarking that our stubbornness was equal to their own. So our 2 ships flew on, parallel and steady towards the archipelago. As we drew closer south, the Waldorf's instruments continued to show no signs of animation, making some of us glad of the Hysteria's company, and others suspicious of their claims that they had picked up any readings at all. It was not until 3:45 that we had crossed the 10th southern parallel, and our anachronometer began to detect a deviation in the time stream 300 feet southwest of our position. Spotting a moving object off the starboard bow, Midshipman Lewis took up the spyglass and called Dr. Atkinson, our consulting biologist, to identify the strange bird he had spied. It was at a distance very similar in outline to a cormorant, though at a closer glance its distinctive plumage suggested a creature utterly out of place in the mid-Atlantic sky, though ultimately Atkinson identified the bird without question. It was a penguin, albeit a lean, wide-winged penguin, and only after reviewing the reports sent out by the expedition did we conclude that it must be the specimen that Van Buren had been experimenting on. That it had escaped and flown so far north by this time prompted worrying suggestions as to the state in which we may find the expedition when we reached the island. A wire from the Hysteria came in, informing us that the penguin was synchronous with a time stream 600,000 years ahead of our own. Without question, this was the product of Van Buren's force fields, and we all considered the strong possibility that all of the test subjects had escaped as the result of some colossal mechanical failure. The thought of what other strange mutations we were likely to encounter preoccupied us greatly, and the remainder of the flight was notably tense aboard the Waldorf. We continued south through sparse layers of stratus clouds, when at 6 o'clock we crossed the 16th parallel south and glimpsed the peaks of the northernmost islands rising above the cloud layer like the summits of mountains. Our pilot reduced speed as we entered the archipelago, and the islands of Paraguas and Corona and St. Sebastian glided past. At length the clouds began to disperse, and we spotted in the distance the looming bulk of La Isla de Locura, silhouetted against the evening sun. As we drew closer and the features of the island became more distinct to our vision, we could not help but feel that there was something not quite right about the outline of the hovering tumulus before us. Something definitely abnormal which we could not quite place, until Midshipman Lewis took up the spyglass and called out for all of us to behold the island through the scope. One by one the spyglass was passed about, and with each eye that met it, there followed a gasp at what was revealed beyond. La Isla de Locura was formed when a buildup of condensed zephyrium gas left by airships and ether tankers seeped into the South Atlantic Ocean until great bulks of Earth were wrenched from the ocean floor and cast skyward 6,000 feet, where they settled and stabilized. The geological composition of the islands in the floating archipelago are sedimentary, with a high salt content and sand in place of soil, rendering it virtually unsuitable for the development of endemic vegetation. And yet the island that faced us beyond the spyglass was far from desolate. A veritable thicket of verdant green foliage blanketed the island. Rosettes of vast, feathered leaves at the end of long green stalks danced and shimmered in the moving ether, and in between the gaps of the windswept canopy we could faintly perceive the presence of stout, wooded trunks and twisting vines. The sight called to mind the images of the dense, cycad forests which once festooned the earth in the Permian Age, hundreds upon hundreds of million years ago. Bewilderment swept across our party. I felt as if our vessel had silently slipped between the fingers of the centuries and landed us in a base, primeval world where humankind does not hold sway. In the midst of the shock at the sight of the plant-laden island, O'Reilly, one of our technicians, called above deck that the anachronometer was detecting multiple anomalies. The Hysteria wired in to inform us that the island was rife with different time streams, ranging from 3 to 900,000 years apart from ours. Alarmed at this information, we immediately set to discerning whether or not it was actually safe to disembark. After an extensive period of instrumental analysis between both our ship and the Hysteria, we deduced that the warp fields that had caused the drastic changes in the island's topography were no longer active, and it was indeed safe to make our approach. Some among our party remarked that this was proof that the crew of the Hysteria had lied when they first warned us to turn away from our course. But there were more among us who, having seen the overgrowth shrouding the island that was meant to be lifeless, were still happy of the Hysteria's company, unable to shake the inexplicable feeling of primal dread at the thought of setting foot in that time-lost forest.